it was August 24th, 2019. Can you remember where you were? Can you at least remember where you were in August of 2019? For the oldest of you, seniors, you were just beginning your freshman year of high school. Everybody else, you were in middle school or something like that. I remember where I was on this night. I was on my couch upstairs in my house, and I was watching a football game. And all of a sudden, a notification came across the screen of my phone that shocked me. I was so surprised. And then after I got the notification, I looked at the screen, and this all unfolded before me. This is what I saw. Andrew Luck is retiring from the NFL. Anybody remember that? Yep. Yeah, the Colts haven't been the same since, okay? Things have been pretty bad. It was shocking. And in fact, it happened during the middle of a Colts preseason game. And he's on the sideline, and this report comes out, and then the crowd starts booing him. It was a bad moment for Colts fans. And it was shocking because Andrew Luck was in his prime for the most part. He was a franchise quarterback. He left a lot of money on the table to retire and to walk away. This is not something that happens. And so in the midst of this, a lot has come out over the years, the 3.5 years since this happened. A lot has come out. Andrew's actually come and talked about this and talked on podcasts and shows and interviews about why he retired and all this kind of stuff. And here's one of the things, of all the things they said, that was most revealing to me. He says this: I haven't been able to live the life I wanted to live. That's what he felt in the midst of this decision. He wasn't able to live the life that he wanted to live. And to us on the outside, we look at it, was like, what are you talking about? You make millions of dollars, you're a starting quarterback in the NFL, you have what everybody else wants. And yet that wasn't the case for him. And so he put it all aside and he walked away and he retired and he's not coming back. And so you have to ask this question, that's got to be a hard decision, right? For a guy to walk away from millions of dollars and the fame and the fortune and all that comes along with being a player in the NFL, he walked away from it. It had to be a difficult decision. But the more that he talks about it, I don't know that it wasn't difficult, but he knew that it was the right thing to do for him. And so I have to ask you this question as we start. I wonder if you've ever given something up that was difficult for you, but you knew that it was the right thing to do. I don't know if you could think of an example of that in your mind right now. You had to give something up. It wasn't easy, but you knew that it was the right thing to do. When I was in high school, when I was a freshman in high school, my dad had a heart attack. He was 42 years old, and he had a heart attack, and he survived it. But in the midst of that, my dad decided that he needed to make some changes in his life, and so he decided to give up smoking. My dad was a smoker, and it didn't last long. He smokes again now. It's not a wise decision. But it shows me just the difficulty of even that, of something that almost killed him, and to give it up has not been easy. Giving things up is often difficult, especially if you're addicted to it, or if it's an important part of your life, or if you feel like you need it. But this is what I want to talk to you about tonight, this idea of focusing on giving something up. And here's why I want to talk to you about this. I want you to see the value of replacing something that is hurting you with something that can benefit you, all right? Maybe you're not contemplating from retiring from the NFL, and I sure hope you're not having to contemplate whether you should stop smoking right now in your life. Maybe it is. But all of us have things in our life that maybe are hurting us or are taking too much time, and maybe we should, for a time, give that up and replace it with something more valuable. The things in your life that you probably need to take a break from so you can focus on things that matter more, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about. In Jesus' time, he lived in a culture, a Jewish culture, that for thousands of years focused on this idea, and it was called fasting, all right? You're probably familiar with this, but maybe you're not if you don't go to church a lot, because we don't talk about this a lot. But it was a common practice. It's not as common today, but it's still around. Fasting was a common practice for Jesus, for his followers, for all Jewish people. It was the practice of giving up food for a certain amount of time and using that time that time and that reminder of when you get hungry to focus on spiritual things. And so Jews would fast for sometimes a week or sometimes a day or multiple days or whatever it was. They would fast for a certain amount of time, and they would use that time that they were fasting to focus on the spiritual, okay? And so it wasn't just during that time, like, oh, I'm skipping lunch, and so during lunch I'd pray, but all throughout the day, when you get hungry, it would remind them to focus on spiritual things and not just the physical things. But as you know, the religious leaders at the time, they started to manipulate this practice and started to use it in different ways. And this is one of the scriptures I want to read to you tonight. It's from Matthew chapter 6, part of the Sermon on the Mount. As Jesus talks about fasting, here's what he says. He says, "And when you fast, don't make it obvious as the hypocrites do. For they try to look miserable and disheveled so people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth. That's the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair, wash your face. Then no one will notice that you are fasting except your Father, who knows what you do in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you." You see, Jesus was trying to point out this idea, this principle that fasting is not about appearing to be spiritual. It's not about what other people see in you and think that of what you are. It's not about the appearance, right? It's about the purpose. The purpose for fasting was to draw you closer to God. And so he points these things out. But I want you to notice something, what he says. He says, when you fast, right? And maybe you've always caught on to this, or maybe this is new, but he doesn't say if you fast or if you decide to fast. It's when you fast. It was an expectation. He believed that the people listening to him, he believed that his disciples, the Jewish people, that they were going to fast. And so he says, when you fast, here's how to do it. Now, let me time out here. That's not going to be the direction of this message. I'm not going to talk to you, it's like a high school edit. I'm not going to talk to you about fasting, okay? That's a great practice. And in fact, I preached a sermon on that earlier last year about fasting, and I talked about biblical fasting, actually fasting from food. And so if you're interested in that, I can send you a link. You can go back and watch it. I can send you a manuscript, whatever you want. But here's what I concluded as a part of that message. I said this about fasting, that it's a discipline to draw you closer to God by focusing on your spiritual need over your physical need. That is what fasting is. It's focusing on your spiritual need over your physical need, okay? So I'm going to ask you to consider this. Could you give something up to focus on things that are spiritual? To focus on your spiritual need over your physical need. Maybe not food, okay? I'm not going to talk about food, but I'm going to talk about other things. Maybe social media, video games, shopping, candy. I mean, that's kind of food, but maybe you could give that up as well. Something else. Here's what I want you to do. Start thinking about this. Is there something in your life that is taking too much of your time, too much of your energy? It's not necessarily bad. I'm not telling you to find something sinful in your life, although maybe you need to do that. I'm asking you to find something that's maybe taking a little bit too much time, a little bit too much of your focus, too much of your passion, that's actually drawing you further away from God, that if you remove that for a time, not forever, okay? Not asking you to get rid of it forever, but for a time, you got rid of it for a time to focus on something spiritual over that physical. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I want you to start thinking about that in that direction, because in a little bit, I'm going to ask you to identify that. So there's something in your life that's drawing you further from God that you could give up for a time to draw a little bit closer to him. So one of my favorite examples of fasting, as we kind of bridge these two ideas together, comes from the Apostle Paul in his life. You probably know that Paul was set apart for missionary work. In fact, if you read your New Testament, so many of the letters that you find in your New Testament are written by Paul. But if you fast or you go back into Paul's story, you remember that Paul used to be a persecutor of Christians, right? That's how his story started. He was someone that, as the Christian movement started, he was a Jew, a zealous Jew, a very religious person that didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ. And so he went after Christians who were believing this and preaching this and put them into prison. That's who he was. He got converted. Jesus showed up in his life. He wanted to become a Christian. So all of a sudden, he has this moment where he starts preaching about Jesus. And the disciples, can you imagine? They're a little scared, right? Like, this guy used to hunt us down, and now all of a sudden he wants to be one of us. It took him a little while to get used to Paul and to accept them into their group, but they did. But at the beginning of Paul's resurgence, he was kind of sidelined. I don't know if the disciples didn't trust him a whole lot. I'm not saying that's the truth. I don't know, but he didn't go anywhere. He was kind of there with disciples. He was in Jerusalem. He kind of taught there, but he wasn't off doing all the missionary work that we saw Paul do later in his life. So what changed? Well, in Acts chapter 13, something changed because Paul at this point had just been where the disciples were. He was in Jerusalem with them, wherever they were. And so he finds himself in Antioch and he's with some of the disciples. And this is what we read. I find it so fascinating. It says, one day, as these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, appoint Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way. I hope that you can see what's happening here. Paul, before he becomes the Paul that we know, this great person that plants churches, that travels the world, that brings people to Jesus, this is how his ministry starts. This is how his mission work starts. They were worshiping the Lord and they were fasting. And then, in the midst of that, the Holy Spirit speaks up into these men's lives and says, appoint these two men for the work that I have for them. And then what do? They fast some more. This was important. This was them at the very beginning of his mission work. He says, I'm going to choose to focus on the spiritual over the physical. I want you to see how important this is. And so tonight, basically, I'm going to challenge you with this. I want you to give up something physical in your life to focus on something spiritual. I'm not going to tell you what that is. You get to decide what that is. You get to pick. You get to choose. But the practice of fasting or the practice of giving up, focusing on the spiritual over the physical will have great benefits in your life. So the rest of the message, I got a couple minutes left. The rest of the message, I'm going to tell you how to do this, okay? That was me convincing you that this is something that we should do. Let me tell you how to do it, how to be successful at this. These are the tips, how to give something up. So again, think about what this is for you. Think about what you could give up. Here's how to do it well. Number one is this, to give something up and to start small. Start small. That's the best way that you can accomplish this is to start small. Don't think about this as giving something up entirely, okay? So like with my dad smoking, he wanted to quit cold turkey and end it and stop it right there. That's not what I'm asking. Well, if you smoke, I would ask you to do that, okay? But that's not what I'm asking you to do tonight. Let's use this example. Let's think of Netflix, all right? Let's say that you feel like I watch too much Netflix and it's a problem for me and I spend a lot of time on that, okay? Could you give up Netflix altogether? Yeah, you could, probably. But that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm going to say, okay, well, what if you say, all right, you know what? I don't have practice or whatever on Mondays, and so I find myself like watching a couple shows. I spend 2 hours on Monday night watching Netflix. What if you just gave up one day, like one night of the week and said, I'm not watching any shows that night, and when I would, I'm going to use my time to focus on something spiritual. I'm going to do something spiritual in place of that time. That's what I'm asking you to do, but I'm asking you to start small, okay? Don't think I have to give up everything all at once, all together, because that's really difficult. I'm asking you to start small. Maybe Netflix isn't your thing. Maybe it's sports. Maybe you watch the sports games. Could you give up one game a week that you normally watch and spend that time focusing on something spiritual? Again, I'm not asking you to identify something sinful in your life. That's a different conversation, okay? If you have something that you're dealing with, talk to your small group leader and talk about how you can accomplish that. I'm asking you to give up something, hear this, discretionary, okay? Something that's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just something that's eating time or focus or passion in your life. If you just took it out for just a time, for a month, to focus on something spiritual in place of that, the benefits that it can bring in your life. So start small. Here's the second thing, is to give something up and do it with a friend. Okay, so give something up and do it with a friend. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because we talk about this a lot, this idea of accountability. You can be way more successful in this if you ask for help, if you do it with someone alongside of you to hold each other accountable. I love this verse from Proverbs chapter 27. You're probably familiar with it. It says, iron sharpens iron, so one friend sharpens another, right? I don't know if you gloss over that, but as you think about how you would sharpen iron or sharpen a blade, they sharpen each other. That's what he's saying. A friend can sharpen you. You guys, if you do this together, can help each other. You can rely on each other so you don't give up, and you can ask questions about how you're spending that time that you give up. All right, here's the third thing. It's to give something up and to remember why. And this is the most important step, I think, because again, this isn't just about getting rid of a bad habit, okay? Eating food was not a bad habit. That's not why people fasted. They fasted because they wanted to replace something in their life that they needed, and so they could focus on the spiritual over the physical. Think of it this way. When you think about fasting, so I haven't done this a ton, but there's been times where I've fasted, and the worst time to fast for me is lunch. That's when I get the most hunger. I could fast over breakfast all day. Sometimes I can even miss dinner and go to bed and be fine. Fasting over lunch is really difficult for me. You know why? Because that 2 o'clock, I don't know if this happens to you at school, you get to 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, you start getting hungry, right? Or does that happen? This would happen to me whenever I fasted over lunch, and my stomach grumbles. And like my body's like, hey, something's wrong, Matt. Like you need food and you need to eat something. And so my stomach starts talking to me. And it's in those moments that it reminds myself that my body is telling, you're missing this. And in that, you can turn and spend that time on God and rely on him and focus on the spiritual. It sounds so strange, but if you've never tried it, I don't know that you can understand it. But once again, I'm not talking about that. I want you to remember why you would abstain from something. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. And I want to make this very clear. I want you to identify one thing that you could give up, okay? Video games, social media for a day, Netflix for a day, shopping for a week. I don't know what it is, okay? You get to decide what that is. I want you to identify one thing that you could give up for a time, whether it's a day, a week, a month, whatever it is. And I also want you to think about what you could replace that with that would be spiritual. Could be prayer, could be reading the Bible, could be talking to a friend about your spiritual life. It could be a number of different things. Could be listen to worship music, okay? But those are the two things I'm going to ask you to identify. I'm trying to make this really practical for you tonight. Identify one thing you give up and one thing to fill that space. And here's why I'm going to ask you to do this. This is the smallest of steps that you can take to start to focus on God and what he's doing in your life and what he wants to do with you. Fasting, when you do that, the hunger reminds you of your need, and it reminds you to focus on God. But I want you to start here. I want you to start with something discretionary, something that you could give up, something that is not entirely important in your life. And here's why I want you to focus on this, because focusing on giving something up because you can gain something greater. That's what I'm asking you to think about. If we all did this, I want you to think about this for a second. If we all started to do this, we would all begin replacing things in our life that are less important and replace them with things that are eternally important or spiritually important. They would bring value into your life over just discretionary things. You would draw closer to God. You would feel his presence a little bit more, and maybe you'd be able to hear what he has to say to you. Because I truly believe that in Acts chapter 13, when Paul and Barnabas were in that room with all the disciples, one of the reasons that they heard what God was telling them to do was because they created the space for God to speak. As they were fasting and worshiping, they were giving up the physical to focus on the spiritual. And in the midst of that, they created the space for the Holy Spirit to speak and say, I want you to set these two apart and send them for the special work that I have for them. Do you want that for yourself? Do you want to create this space and create the opportunity for God to speak to you, to reveal something to you, to open something up in your life that maybe you've never experienced with him before by just removing something and focusing on something more important? That's what I'm asking you to consider. So here's what we're going to do. In a minute, the team's going to come up here and we're going to have a response song, but here's what I'm going to ask you to do. As they start the song, I just want you to stay in your seat, and I want you to spend that minute identifying what that is, what you could give up, what you could replace it with. And I want you to pray to God on your own, or if you really want to, you can pray with somebody next to you. I want you to spend a moment giving that up to God with you first, before you could feel compelled in your small groups and someone asks you a question, well, what can you give up? Do it right now on your own, between you and God. What is that for me? And when you've done that and you've prayed, and you've had that connection with God, I want you to stand and join the team in singing. But spend the moment before you do that, before you stand up and sing some words, I want you to go through this process with you and God alone. Remember, giving something up isn't a loss because you will gain so much more in the process.